Picture this, a river so powerful, so central to life itself, that an entire civilization grew along its banks, a ribbon of water cutting through the desert that became the very soul of ancient Egypt. For thousands of years, the Nile was not just a source of water, it was the nation's highway, its economic backbone, its lifeblood, and navigating this mighty river, with its hidden sandbanks, shifting currents, and seasonal floods, was a task of monumental importance. It wasn't just about getting from one city to another, it was about sustaining an empire, moving colossal stones for pyramids, trading gold and grain, and connecting a kingdom that stretched for hundreds of miles. This was a challenge that demanded more than simple boats. It required a level of skill and understanding so profound, it has been all but forgotten by time. Today, we are going to recover those secrets. We are going to step onto the deck of a papyrus vessel and see the world through the eyes of a master Nile sailor. Forget everything you know about modern navigation. There were no GPS satellites, no detailed charts, not even a magnetic compass to guide their way. In an age where we can pinpoint our location to within a few feet with a device in our pockets, the idea of sailing such a vast and unpredictable river seems almost impossible. Yet, they did it with breathtaking precision. These sailors possessed a deep, intimate knowledge of their world that we can barely comprehend. They didn't fight the river, they learned to listen to it, to feel its rhythms, and understand its moods as if it were a living being. Their expertise was the invisible engine of pharaonic power, a secret science passed down through generations that allowed the Egyptian empire to flourish for not just centuries, but for millennia. This was a knowledge system born of acute observation, woven into the very fabric of their culture and their connection to the cosmos. So how did they do it? What were the lost navigation secrets of the Nile River sailors that made such incredible feats possible? The answers are more wondrous than you might think. It was a symphony of skills, a combination of reading the stars with the precision of an astronomer, understanding the whispering language of the wind, and interpreting the subtle signs written on the water's surface. They developed techniques that allowed them to travel by night as confidently as by day, to sense underwater hazards before they could be seen, and to use the river itself as their guide. This journey we are about to take together is not just a history lesson, it is a rediscovery of human ingenuity at its finest. We will unravel how these ancient mariners turned a challenging river into a predictable road, unlocking the methods that built a civilization and exploring a wisdom that connected heaven and earth. Get ready to see the Nile in a way you never have before, and to be truly amazed by the brilliance of these forgotten masters of the river. To truly grasp their genius, we must first immerse ourselves in the world they knew so intimately. The Nile was not a passive backdrop. It was a dynamic, forceful personality with its own moods and rhythms. One of its most defining and baffling characteristics, especially to outsiders, was its direction. And like almost every other major river in the world, the Nile flows from south to north. This simple fact had profound implications for ancient travel. If you were sailing downstream, you were carried north by the current, a relatively smooth journey. But sailing upstream against that powerful flow was the ultimate test of a sailor's skill. They couldn't simply rely on the water to take them where they wanted to go. They had to harness other forces, primarily the wind, to conquer the river's natural pull. This unique northward flow meant that to an Egyptian, going down the river meant traveling north, while going up meant a strenuous journey south, a complete reversal of our intuitive geographical thinking. Then, there was the river's heartbeat, the annual inundation. Every year, like clockwork, the Nile would flood its banks, transforming the arid desert into a vast, fertile oasis. This wasn't a destructive deluge, but a life-giving event, depositing rich, black silt that made Egypt the breadbasket of the ancient world. For the sailor, this flood was a double-edged sword. It dramatically widened the river, submerging familiar landmarks and sandbanks, making navigation perilous for the uninitiated. Yet it also raised water levels, allowing heavily laden cargo ships carrying stone for monuments or grain for trade to travel routes that were too shallow in the rest of the year. The sailors had to be masters of timing, knowing exactly when the waters would rise and recede. planning their most ambitious voyages around this predictable yet transformative seasonal cycle. But the river's surface was a mask, hiding a constantly shifting labyrinth beneath. The Nile was not a single, clean channel. It was a network of braided streams, islands, and most dangerously, unpredictable sandbanks. These submerged hazards could be sculpted and relocated by a single strong current overnight. A channel that was deep and safe one week could be a shipwrecking trap the next. This is where the sailors' profound, localized knowledge became priceless. They learned to read the water's surface like a map. A slight change in the water's texture, a subtle ripple, or a particular swirl could indicate a hidden sandbar just below. They knew the whispers of the river, understanding that calm, glassy water often meant deep channels, while a choppy, disturbed surface might signal shallow, dangerous ground. Theirs was a continuous, real-time analysis of the river's ever-changing personality, a skill honed over a lifetime of observation that turned a treacherous waterway into a manageable and even predictable highway. These masters of the river were not a single, homogeneous group, but a highly specialized hierarchy, each member playing a critical role in the dance of navigation. At the pinnacle stood the captain, a figure of immense respect and authority. He was far more than a simple helmsman. He was a keeper of secrets, a living repository of knowledge passed down through generations. His understanding encompassed the star maps of the night sky, the subtle language of currents, and the memorized contours of the riverbed for hundreds of miles. This knowledge was so vital to the state that it was often considered a sacred trust. The captain's word was law on the vessel, his decisions carrying the weight of life and death for his crew and the valuable cargo they transported, whether it was gold from Nubia or limestone blocks destined for a pharaoh's tomb. The crew supporting him were the engine of the ship, a team of highly skilled individuals. While some might have been conscripted for specific military campaigns or large-scale state projects, many were professional sailors who learned their trade from childhood, growing up on the riverbanks and accompanying their fathers and uncles on voyages. They developed an almost instinctual feel for handling the heavy linen sails to catch the prevailing north wind, or the coordination needed to wield the long steering oars at the stern. Their strength and endurance were legendary, especially when rowing against the current on windless days. This was not the drudgery of slaves, but the practiced skill of professionals who took pride in their work, their chants and songs keeping time for the oars and becoming the soundtrack of the Nile itself. In terms of social status, these sailors occupied a unique and respected position. They were essential civil servants, integral to the infrastructure that held the kingdom together. A successful captain, in charge of a royal shipment or a military transport, would have enjoyed a comfortable standing, perhaps rewarded with land or other honors. The common crewmen, while not among the elite, were vital cogs in the machine of state. Their work ensured the flow of information, as royal decrees and messages traveled fastest by boat. They enabled the economy, moving grain from the fertile north to the administrative centers in the south, and transporting luxuries and raw materials that fueled Egyptian culture and power. Without their silent, constant work, the empire would have fractured into isolated pockets, unable to project its power or maintain its cultural unity. This role became even more critical during military campaigns. The Nile was Egypt's primary military highway. Soldiers and equipment were moved by boat with an efficiency that land travel could never match. In these contexts, the sailors transformed from traders into a vital component of the army's logistics. Their ability to navigate quickly, predictably, and safely allowed for rapid deployment of troops and supplies, giving Egyptian forces a strategic mobility that their enemies often lacked. They were the unsung heroes of military conquests, their expertise enabling the pharaohs to control a territory stretching over 700 miles from the delta to the First Cataract. They were the threads that wove the two lands of Upper and Lower Egypt into a single, cohesive tapestry, making the river not just a geographical feature, but the very circulatory system of a civilization. To understand how they mastered the river, we need to look at the tools of their trade, the vessels themselves. The ancient Egyptians were master shipwrights, and they didn't have a single type of boat. They developed a stunning variety of watercraft, each engineered with a specific purpose in mind, perfectly adapted to the unique demands of the Nile. At the most basic level, you had the humble skiffs and small reed boats. Crafted from bundled papyrus stalks, these are the workhorses of daily life. Think of them as the pickup trucks of ancient Egypt. Fishermen used them to cast nets in the shallows. Farmers employed them to travel from one riverbank field to another, and hunters navigated the dense papyrus marshes in these lightweight, agile craft. Their construction was brilliant in its simplicity. By lashing together bundles of the buoyant papyrus plant, they created vessels that were incredibly stable and, crucially, flexible. They could bend with the waves and brush against sandbanks without splintering, a perfect design for the ever-changing river environment. But for serious travel and heavy lifting, they turned to wood. The development of large, wooden plank ships was a technological revolution that supercharged Egyptian civilization. Early on, they used local acacia and sycamore fig trees, but as their ambitions grew, so did their need for superior timber. This led to seafaring expeditions to the land of Canaan to acquire mighty cedar logs from Lebanon. These cedar planks were longer, stronger, and more resistant to rot, allowing Egyptian shipbuilders to construct vessels of a scale previously unimaginable. The techniques they used were advanced, employing sophisticated joinery. Instead of just nailing planks together, they often used a method called mortise and tenon, where a protruding piece of wood from one plank would fit snugly into a carved-out hole in the next, creating an incredibly strong and durable hull. These ships were then sewn together with rope lashings passed through drilled holes, giving the hull a degree of flexibility that was essential for navigating a river full of hidden obstacles. The most awe-inspiring of these wooden giants were the cargo ships. We have records and reliefs depicting vessels that were true marvels of ancient engineering, designed to transport staggering loads. Imagine a ship nearly the length of a modern Olympic swimming pool, carrying two massive granite obelisks, each weighing hundreds of tons, from the quarries at Aswan downriver to the temple complexes at Luxor and beyond. How did they manage such a feat? The design was key. These ships had a broad, flat-bottomed hull. This gave them immense stability and allowed them to sit upright in relatively shallow water, a necessity for a river with a variable depth. They were essentially giant, buoyant platforms. They were powered primarily by sails on a single tall mast when traveling north with the current and the prevailing wind at their back. For the arduous journey south against the current, or for precise maneuvering in harbors, they relied on large crews of rowers. A fleet of such vessels was the logistics network that built the pyramids and fed the cities, a silent armada moving the very foundations of the empire. Alongside these practical workhorses, there was another, more mystical category of boat, the papyriform vessel. These were not made of papyrus, but were wooden ships built to resemble the much older reed boats. Their elegant, elongated hulls curved upwards dramatically at the prow and stern, mimicking the tied ends of a papyrus skiff. Why build a sophisticated wooden ship to look like a simple reed boat? The answer lies in religion and symbolism. This design was deeply traditional, harkening back to a timeless, mythical past. These vessels were reserved for the gods and the dead. The most famous example is the Great Solar Bark, the boat upon which the sun god Ra was believed to sail across the sky each day and through the treacherous underworld each night. Pharaohs, seeking to emulate the gods in death, had their own magnificent funerary barges, like the stunningly preserved ship found buried next to the Great Pyramid of Khufu. These boats were not just for show, they were meant for actual ritual journeys or for the pharaoh's soul to use in the afterlife, ensuring they could travel with the gods for eternity. So, from the fisherman's humble skiff to the pharaoh's celestial barge, the boat was more than transportation. It was a fundamental expression of Egyptian life, death, and divine order. With the river's personality and their specialized vessels established, we can now truly appreciate the first great advantage the Nile offered its sailors, the gift of downstream travel. For any journey heading north towards the Mediterranean Sea and the bustling delta ports, the river itself became a powerful, reliable ally. This was the effortless leg of the voyage, a stark contrast to the immense effort required to go south. The northward flowing current acted as a natural conveyor belt, a constant, invisible force pulling ships toward their destination. A captain setting out from the southern city of Thebes, for instance, bound for the capital at Memphis, could rely on this steady flow to do most of the work. The strategy was beautifully simple. Once the vessel was pointed in the right direction and clear of the riverbank, the crew's active role could become minimal. They might raise a small, simple square sail just to add a bit of extra speed, but very often, they could simply stow the oars and drift, surrendering to the river's gentle, persistent tug. This was not a passive or haphazard drift. It was a controlled and predictable journey. The average speed of the Nile's current varies along its length and with the seasons, but historians and hydrologists estimate it typically moves between 1 and 2 miles per hour. This might sound slow to our modern sensibilities, but over the course of a day, it was remarkably effective. A vessel carried by the current alone could cover 20 to 30 miles in a single day without a single person lifting an oar. This transformed the logistics of transporting heavy cargo. Imagine a ship laden with 100-ton granite blocks from the quarries at Aswan. Propelling such a mass by human power alone would be a Herculean task. But by harnessing the current, the primary challenge shifted from propulsion to steering. The crew's energy was conserved for navigation, for managing the steering oars at the stern to keep the ship centered in the deepest part of the channel and away from sandbank. This efficient use of natural energy allowed for the movement of goods on a scale that was simply impossible by land, where dragging such weights would require immense animal and human labor over treacherous desert track. The experience of such a journey would have been profoundly different from our modern, engine-powered travel. It was a quiet, observant passage. With the ship moving at the pace of the flowing water, the world seemed to unfold slowly along the banks. The crew could watch the changing landscape, from the narrow, cliff-lined valleys of Upper Egypt to the vast, marshy expanses of the Delta. They had time to note familiar landmarks, a distinctive grove of palm trees, an unusual rock formation, a temple pylon visible in the distance, all of which added to their mental map of the river. This steady, predictable progress also allowed for precise scheduling. A captain knew almost to the day how long it would take to deliver a shipment of grain from a southern estate to a northern warehouse. This reliability was the bedrock of Egyptian administration and economy, enabling the central government to collect taxes in kind from across the country and redistribute resources where they were needed, all flowing as smoothly and inevitably as the river itself. The downstream voyage was a testament to the Egyptians' genius for working with their environment, not against it, turning a simple geographic fact into the engine of an empire. While the journey north was a peaceful drift, the voyage south presented a monumental challenge that truly separated the novice from the master. This was the ultimate test of a Nile sailor's skill, fighting the river's powerful, unrelenting current to travel upstream. Every inch of progress had to be earned through sheer ingenuity and brute force, a coordinated effort that turned the riverbanks into a stage for one of history's most impressive feats of human logistics. The primary weapon in this struggle was a technique known as towing, or tracking. Teams of men, known as towmen, would disembark and walk along the bank, hauling the heavy vessel forward with thick, braided ropes made from papyrus or flax. This was back-breaking labor under the scorching Egyptian sun. The towmen had to navigate uneven, sometimes treacherous terrain, pulling in unison to the rhythm of a work chant that set the pace and synchronized their efforts. Their progress was slow and methodical, a physical battle of attrition against the water's persistent drag. For large state-sponsored ships, like those carrying stone for a pyramid, these teams could number in the hundreds, a human engine slowly dragging a floating mountain against the flow of the river itself. Yet, the riverbank was not always a viable path. Dense papyrus marshes, steep cliffs, or private farmland could block the way, forcing the crew to rely on their strength within the vessel itself. This is where the power of the oar came into play. Rowing against the current was an arduous task reserved for these difficult stretches or for precise maneuvers around obstacles. The Egyptians used long, heavy oars that required multiple men to operate each one. The rowers would sit on benches, driving their oars into the water in a powerful, coordinated stroke. The sound of the overseer's drum or chant would have been constant, a vital tool for maintaining the rhythm necessary to make any headway against the flow. This method was incredibly energy-intensive and could not be sustained for the entire length of a long journey, but it provided the essential flexibility and power needed to navigate the river's more complex sections where towing was impossible. The most elegant solution, however, lay not on the bank or in the muscles of the crew, but in the sky above. The Egyptians discovered a perfect natural counterbalance to the north-flowing current, a reliably south-blowing wind. For most of the year, especially during the sailing season, the prevailing wind along the Nile blows from the north. This meant that while the current tried to push a ship toward the Mediterranean, the wind was consistently blowing in the opposite direction, back toward the river's source. The sailors learned to harness this wind with brilliant efficiency. By raising their large, square linen sails, they could capture this northerly breeze and be pushed south, directly against the current. This was the hallmark of a truly skilled captain, knowing exactly how to set the sail to maximize the wind's power, effectively using one natural force to conquer another. It transformed the journey from a grueling physical struggle into a graceful, wind-powered glide. A ship sailing south with a strong northerly wind could actually travel faster than the current flowing against it, making upstream travel not just possible, but surprisingly efficient. In practice, a voyage south was a dynamic ballet that combined all three methods. A captain would use his deep knowledge of the river to plan each leg of the journey. On long, straight stretches with accessible banks, the tow teams would be deployed, conserving the energy of the crew on board. When the wind was favorable and strong, the sail would be hoisted, and the ship would make excellent time, giving the towman a respite. In cramped quarters, or when navigating around islands and sandbanks, the oarsmen would take over for fine control. The true genius of Nile navigation was this fluid adaptability, this ability to read the river and the sky moment by moment, and employ the most effective technique for the conditions. It was this masterful combination of human power and natural wisdom that allowed them to defy the river's greatest challenge, ensuring that the lifeblood of Egypt could flow in both directions, binding the kingdom together in a continuous cycle of trade, communication, and power. This mastery of the wind, particularly the journey south, brings us to one of the most brilliant elements of their craft, understanding the sky itself. While they could muscle their way upstream with ropes and oars, the true elegance of Nile navigation was in harnessing a predictable, powerful natural engine, the Etesian wind. For the ancient Egyptian sailor, these weren't just occasional breezes. They were a seasonal clockwork, a celestial gift that made the impossible voyage not only possible, but efficient. Today, we know these as the Meltemi winds, a system that blows steadily from the north across the eastern Mediterranean and down the Nile Valley throughout the summer months. This predictability was absolutely crucial. It meant that for a significant portion of the year, a captain planning a journey from Memphis to Thebes could be virtually certain of having a steady, powerful ally at his back. He would schedule the most important state voyages, transporting stone for a new temple or grain for the army, to align perfectly with this windy season, turning a logistical nightmare into a planned, manageable operation. The technology they used to capture this force was deceptively simple yet perfectly adapted: the large, square sail. Unlike the complex rigging of later sailing ships with multiple masts and adjustable sails, the Egyptian design was a monument to straightforward efficiency. A single, sturdy mast made from a choice cedar log was stepped amidships, supporting a broad sail of woven linen, but the genius was in its control. The sail wasn't fixed. It could be raised, lowered, and most importantly, angled using a network of braided ropes known as sheets and braces. To catch a following wind blowing from directly behind them, the sailors would set the sail square across the ship. However, the Etesian winds weren't always perfectly straight. They could come from the northeast or northwest. Here, the sailors' skill shone. By carefully adjusting the tension on the ropes, they could twist the yardarm at the top of the mast, effectively angling the sail to catch the wind even when it wasn't directly astern. This ability to tack downwind, to use a modern term, allowed them to maintain forward momentum against the current even when the wind direction was slightly off. a subtle but vital technique that separated a competent crew from a masterful one. The coordination required to manage this heavy sail in a brisk wind was immense, and it was here that rhythm became as important as rope. While we have no surviving sheet music from ancient Egypt, tomb paintings and inscriptions strongly suggest that work chants were an integral part of shipboard life. Imagine the scene. The wind is filling the sail, the great linen sheet straining against its lines. A lead sailor, perhaps the captain or a boatswain, would call out a strong, rhythmic chant. This served multiple critical purposes. Primarily, it synchronized the crew's movements. On the command, a team would haul together on a single rope with unified effort, a necessity when handling such large, heavy equipment. This rhythm transformed a chaotic, strenuous task into a coordinated, efficient action, preventing injury and ensuring adjustments were made smoothly and quickly. Beyond mere practicality, these chants also built morale. The repetitive musical cadence helped the crew find a collective rhythm, turning exhausting labor into a shared, almost ceremonial activity that strengthened their bond and focused their minds on the collective goal of conquering the river. Their understanding of meteorology went far beyond just knowing the summer winds would blow. These sailors were acute observers of microsigns, reading the immediate environment for short-term forecasts. They knew that a sudden change in the behavior of birds like swallows flying low over the water could indicate an approaching shift in air pressure. They interpreted the formation of certain clouds on the horizon as precursors to a strengthening breeze or an unexpected calm. The feel of the air on their skin, the subtle way ripples moved across the water's surface, all of this data was continuously processed by the experienced captain. This hyper-local knowledge allowed them to make real-time decisions. He might order the sail reefed or partially lowered if he sensed a gust building, preventing the ship from being overpowered. Conversely, he might catch a fleeting breath of wind from an unexpected direction by adjusting the sail when others would have given up and reached for the oars. This intimate, lifelong conversation with the atmosphere meant that no two voyages were ever the same, and the master sailor was the one who could dance with the wind's every whim, using its power to write his own story upon the water. But the most profound navigation tool available to them was not on the water or in the wind. It was painted across the velvet canvas of the night sky. For the Nile sailors, the stars were not just distant points of light. They were a dynamic, rotating map, a celestial GPS that provided unerring direction when the riverbanks melted into darkness. Theirs was an astronomical knowledge deeply woven into their mythology, transforming cold, scientific observation into a living dialogue with the gods. This connection is perfectly illustrated by the constellations we still recognize today. The impressive grouping of stars we call Orion was known to them as Sa, the celestial embodiment of Osiris, the god of death and rebirth. Similarly, the 7 bright stars of the Big Dipper, which circle the North Pole, were visualized not as a ladle, but as the thigh of Seth, the god of chaos and disorder. This wasn't mere storytelling, it was a powerful mnemonic device, a way to remember and track these crucial celestial markers by embedding them into the very core of their cultural and religious identity. The cornerstone of their celestial navigation was the search for a fixed point, an unchanging reference in the seemingly spinning sky, while the Earth's pole star in their era was not Polaris, as it is for us, but a fainter star called Thuban in the constellation Draco. The principle was identical. This star held a special, near motionless position in the northern heavens, with all other stars appearing to rotate around it throughout the night. For a sailor on the Nile, this was the ultimate anchor. By identifying this pole star, a captain could instantly orient himself. Knowing where true north lay meant he could then deduce every other direction. If he was traveling south, he would keep the pole star directly behind him. To head north, he would steer toward it. This single, constant reference point transformed the bewildering complexity of the night sky into a simple and reliable compass, providing a bearing that was unaffected by the river's meandering bends or the disorienting vastness of the featureless desert landscape. But their expertise went far beyond finding north. They possessed a detailed understanding of the stars' nightly and seasonal journeys. They knew that certain constellations would rise at specific times, and in specific positions on the horizon depending on the time of year. This knowledge turned the sky into a cosmic clock and calendar. A sailor observing the heliacal rising of Sirius, its first appearance just before dawn after a period of invisibility, knew that the annual inundation was imminent, a critical piece of information for planning voyages. During a night journey, they would track the progression of familiar asterisms across the sky, the movement of Orion's belt or the rotation of the Thigh of Seth around the pole acted as hour hands on a giant clock. By noting how far a particular constellation had moved from its position at sunset, a seasoned navigator could estimate the time of night with remarkable accuracy, allowing him to judge the progress of his voyage and anticipate the coming dawn. This celestial skill was particularly vital for the most daring of voyages, night travel. While journeying after sunset was inherently riskier due to hidden sandbanks, it offered immense advantages. The cooler temperatures were less taxing on the crew, whether they were rowing or managing the sail. For military movements, darkness provided a cloak of secrecy. And on long journeys, it effectively doubled the travel time in a day. To navigate these dark waters, the sailors would have used a combination of techniques. They kept the pole star in sight for general direction, but they also used what is known as a transit. They would line up two bright stars that rose or set in a direction parallel to the stretch of river they were traveling. By keeping those two stars perfectly aligned as they moved, they could maintain a straight course down the center of the channel for miles, a technique of stunning precision that required an intimate familiarity with the heavens. This fusion of myth, astronomy, and practical seamanship allowed them to sail with confidence even when the sun and the river's familiar landmarks were lost to the night, guided by the immutable laws of the cosmos. While the stars provided a flawless map by night, the sun served as the primary guide during the long hours of daylight, its dependable arc across the heavens offering a continuous stream of navigational data. For the Nile sailor, the sun was more than a source of light and heat. It was a dynamic clock and compass combined, its movements so deeply understood that they formed the bedrock of daily travel. The fundamental principle was simple yet powerful. The sun consistently rose in the general east and set in the general west. This gave the sailor an immediate, constant sense of orientation. If he was heading south, he knew the morning sun would be on his right side, warming his eastern flank, and in the afternoon, it would shift to his left as it descended in the west. This constant awareness of the sun's position relative to the boat's heading was as instinctual as checking a rear-view mirror is for a driver today, a subconscious update that kept the vessel on its correct bearing throughout the day. But their understanding went far deeper than simple east and west. The Egyptians were meticulous observers of the sun's changing behavior throughout the year. They recognized that the sun's path wasn't fixed. It migrated north and south between the solstices. In the summer, the sun reached a higher point in the sky at noon, casting shorter shadows, while in the winter, its arc was lower and longer. This seasonal dance had profound practical implications for the sailor. The angle of the sunlight directly affected the visibility on the river. A high summer sun might create more glare on the water's surface, making it harder to spot the subtle discoloration that signaled a shallow sandbank. A lower winter sun, however, could cast longer, more revealing shadows across the water, potentially highlighting slight changes in the river's texture. A skilled captain would account for this, knowing that the time of year changed not just the temperature, but the very quality of light he had to work with, adjusting his observational techniques accordingly. One of the most ingenious methods they likely used for timekeeping was a simple shadow clock. While we have surviving examples of these devices from tombs and temples, a resourceful sailor wouldn't need a formal instrument. The ship itself could become a giant sundial. By observing the shadow cast by the mast or a vertical oar onto the deck, a sailor could mark the progression of the day. As the sun moved from east to west, the shadow would sweep across the planks. He might have made simple scratch marks on the deck, noting where the shadow fell at what he knew to be mid-morning or mid-afternoon based on a lifetime of experience. This allowed him to estimate the time elapsed since sunrise and, crucially, how much daylight remained. This was vital information for deciding when to begin looking for a safe anchorage for the night, a decision that could mean the difference between a peaceful evening and a dangerous encounter with a hidden hazard in the dark. This ability to estimate the time of day directly tied into calculating distance traveled, a concept known as dead reckoning. While they didn't have precise instruments to measure speed, an experienced captain had a deep, intuitive feel for it. He knew approximately how fast his ship moved when drifting with the current, when being towed by a team on the bank, or when under full sail with a good wind. By combining this estimated speed with the time gauge from the sun's position, he could make a remarkably accurate guess of the distance covered. He would constantly cross-reference this mental calculation with his intimate knowledge of the river's landmarks. If he estimated he had traveled about 15 miles since passing a certain temple, and he knew that a distinctive bend in the river lined with acacia trees lay roughly 15 miles further on, the appearance of those trees right on cue would confirm his dead reckoning was correct. This continuous feedback loop, observing the sun, estimating time and speed, and confirming with visual landmarks, created a robust and reliable navigation system that required no tools beyond acute observation and a well-trained memory. The sun also dictated the rhythm of the voyage itself, governing the start and end of the sailing day. The period just after sunrise was particularly valuable. The air was often calm, the light was soft and clear, and the sun's low angle created ideal conditions for reading the river. The long shadows of the early morning made the water's surface easier to read, revealing subtle currents and ripples that indicated the deeper channel. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, the heat intensified, and the crew's focus might shift from navigation to endurance. The decision of when to stop was equally solar dependent. A wise captain knew that attempting to navigate unfamiliar stretches of the river in the fading light of dusk was a recipe for disaster. The sun's descent toward the horizon was his signal to begin looking for a known, safe mooring spot, a sheltered inlet or a well-established landing point, and ensuring his ship and crew were secure before the celestial handoff to the star-guided navigators of the night. Yet, for all the grandeur of celestial navigation, the most constant and reliable guide for a Nile sailor was found not in the heavens, but directly along the riverbanks themselves. This was the art of piloting, a hyper-local, intimate form of wayfinding that transformed the familiar shoreline into a living, breathing map. While the stars provided direction and the wind supplied power, it was the visual tapestry of the landscape that offered the precise moment-to-moment guidance needed to avoid disaster. Every twist and turn of the river held a story, and every distinctive feature served as a signpost. A master pilot didn't just see a random cliff or a grove of trees. He saw a critical node in a mental database built over a lifetime of careful observation, a knowledge so vital it was a sailor's most cherished inheritance. This mental map was composed of a stunning variety of landmarks, each serving a specific purpose. Some were grand and unmistakable, designed by nature or by man to be seen from miles away. A dramatic limestone cliff face, bleached white by the sun and carved by the wind into a peculiar shape, could act as a major turning point, signaling the approach to a significant bend in the river. The gleaming white walls and towering pylons of a riverside temple, like those at Karnak or Edfu, were not just places of worship, but crucial navigational beacons. Their massive structures were visible long before a sailor reached the city, providing both a welcome sight and a clear indicator of his progress along a long journey. These large-scale markers gave the captain a macro view of his position, confirming the ship was on the correct overall course. But the true genius of the pilot lay in his attention to the smallest details, the features an untrained eye would completely overlook. He would memorize a specific, gnarled acacia tree that leaned at a precise angle over a particularly safe channel. He would note a unique coloration in the riverbank where a particular type of clay stained the soil a reddish-brown, a sign that the water was deep just offshore. A small, isolated cluster of palm trees growing in a specific configuration could indicate the location of a submerged spring, which often meant the surrounding riverbed was clear of shifting sand. Even the behavior of local wildlife became part of this system. A certain rocky outcrop known to host a colony of nesting birds might serve as a marker for a hidden, treacherous current. This was not a written chart, but a sensory one, written in the language of the landscape itself. The process of learning this lore was a sacred tradition, an oral history passed directly from an experienced captain to his apprentices, often within the same family. A young boy learning the trade would spend years traveling with his father or uncle, not just as a deckhand, but as a student. The elder would constantly point out these features, drilling their names and meanings into the boy's memory. See that bend ahead, where the river doubles back on itself like a coiled snake? Steer wide there, for the current pushes strongly toward the eastern bank, where a sandbar has lain since my own grandfather's time. This knowledge was shared through stories and songs, making it easier to remember. A catchy chant describing the sequence of landmarks between two major cities could function as an auditory map, allowing a sailor to mentally check off his progress against a rhythmic, memorized list. This generational knowledge was especially critical during the annual inundation. When the floodwaters rose, they submerged the normal riverbanks, drowning the smaller, low-lying landmarks and transforming the familiar world into a vast, featureless lake. To an inexperienced sailor, this was a terrifying disorientation, but to a master pilot, the higher-order landmarks became even more important. The temple on the hill, the distinctive mountain peak in the distance, the cliff that remained above the waterline, they became the only reference points in a drowned world. The pilot knew that even though the river was wider, its fundamental channels, guided by the unseen deeper geology, remained in roughly the same place. By lining up these distant, permanent features, he could still trace the invisible path of the main channel, navigating with confidence where others saw only chaos. This ability to read the land in both its normal and flooded states was the ultimate mark of expertise, a seamless fusion of memory, observation, and an almost spiritual connection to the river's enduring soul. Of course, all this celestial and landmark-based navigation would mean nothing if the ship ran aground on a hidden sandbank, a constant and immediate threat that required a completely different set of skills. While the stars guided the overall journey and the landmarks confirmed their position, avoiding disaster required a much more intimate, hands-on conversation with the river itself. This wasn't about looking up or far away, it was about reading the water directly in front of the hull, interpreting its subtle whispers to sense what lay beneath the surface. The Nile's depth was a fickle thing, changing not just with the seasons, but from one day to the next as currents sculpted and reshaped the sandy bottom. To navigate this underwater labyrinth, sailors became experts in two critical arts, taking physical soundings and interpreting the visual language of the water. The most direct and vital tool for this task was the sounding pole. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a depth finder, a simple yet brilliantly effective instrument. It was a long, slender pole, often made of a sturdy, lightweight wood like acacia, and it could be as long as 5 or 6 meters, or about 16 to 20 feet. The true genius was in its calibration. Along its length, the pole was marked with clear, distinct measurements, much like a giant ruler. These marks were often notches or bands of different colored paint, allowing the sailor taking the sounding to instantly read the depth even with the pole mostly submerged. A sailor, stationed at the bow of the ship, would heave this pole forward into the water, plunging it straight down until it hit the riverbed. The moment it struck bottom, his fingers would feel the vibration, and his eyes would instantly check the waterline against the markings. He would then call out the depth in a loud, clear voice for the captain and helmsman to hear. A call of 4 cubits deep might mean full speed ahead, while a nervous shout of 2 cubits would be an immediate alarm, signaling the helmsman to steer hard to port or starboard to avoid grounding their vessel. This process was continuous and rhythmic, especially in tricky, known shallows or when approaching a landing. The sounder's chant, 5 cubits, 4.5, 4, would become a steady heartbeat of caution, guiding the ship's progress through the invisible terrain below. The role of the sounder was one of immense responsibility. He had to have a keen sense of touch to distinguish between the firm thud of hitting a sandbank and the softer sink into muddy silt. He needed to work quickly and accurately, his actions coordinated with the helmsman's reactions. A moment's delay or a misread measurement could mean the difference between a safe passage and a disastrous halt that could take days to free the ship from, potentially damaging the hull and spoiling the cargo. This was navigation in its most immediate and tactile form, a literal feeling out of the path ahead. But even before the sounding pole touched the bottom, the most skilled sailors could often predict shallow water simply by watching the river's surface. They developed an almost magical ability to read the water, interpreting visual cues that were invisible to the untrained eye. The color of the Nile was their first clue. Over deep channels, where the water was clear and dark, it often took on a deeper green or blue-green hue. In contrast, shallow areas over sandy bottoms reflected more light, appearing significantly lighter, often a pale yellow or brownish green. A sharp-eyed captain, watching a patch of light-colored water appear ahead, would know to steer away long before the sounder needed to confirm the danger. Even more subtle were the textures and patterns on the water's surface. The flow of the current over an uneven riverbed created distinct ripples and waves. A smooth, glassy patch surrounded by ripples often indicated a deep, calm channel where the current flowed freely and unimpeded. Conversely, a small, choppy area, what modern boaters might call a riffle, could signal a shallow sandbank just below the surface. As the main current was forced to squeeze over this submerged obstacle, it would speed up and become turbulent, creating those telltale disturbances. The sailors also learned to recognize a specific phenomenon known as a boil or an upwelling. This is where water, after flowing over a submerged bank, wells up from below on the downstream side, creating a circular, swirling pattern on the surface. Spotting one of these boils was a sure sign that a significant hazard lay directly upstream. This knowledge transformed the river from a uniform sheet of water into a topographical map, where every shimmer, every ripple, and every change in hue told a story about the hidden world below, allowing the master navigator to steer his ship safely through a landscape only he could see. This ability to interpret the river's surface was a form of literacy, a secret language written in light and shadow that every master sailor had to learn. They understood that the Nile's color was not a single, uniform blue or green, but a constantly shifting palette of hues, each one a direct message about the depth and composition of the riverbed below. The logic behind this was surprisingly straightforward, yet it took a lifetime of observation to master its subtleties. Over the deepest parts of the channel, where the water was clear and dark, the river often appeared a deep, almost blackish green or a rich blue-green. This was the color of safety, of deep water where the current flowed freely and the hull had plenty of clearance. In stark contrast, shallow areas over sandy or silty bottoms acted like reflective surfaces. The pale sand or light-colored silt at the bottom bounced sunlight back up through the water, making these zones appear significantly lighter, often a pale yellow, a brownish green, or milky turquoise. A sharp-eyed captain, watching a patch of this light-colored water appear directly in his path, would know to change course immediately, steering his vessel back toward the reassuring darkness of the deep channel. But the code of the river went far beyond simple color. The texture of the water's surface provided an even more dynamic and immediate warning system. The flow of a massive current over an uneven riverbed creates distinct patterns of ripples and waves, much like wind blowing over a field of tall grass. A smooth, glassy patch surrounded by smaller ripples was a highly prized sign. This often indicated a deep, calm channel where the water was moving swiftly and unimpeded, with no shallow obstacles to disturb its flow. It was a highway of water, a path of least resistance that experienced sailors would actively seek out. Conversely, a small, choppy area, what modern boaters call a riffle, was a clear signal of danger. When the main body of the current was forced to squeeze up and over a submerged sandbank, it would accelerate and become turbulent, breaking the surface into a distinct, agitated pattern. Spotting one of these riffles ahead was like seeing a road sign that read "shallow water ahead," giving the crew precious moments to adjust their course. One of the most sophisticated signs a sailor could recognize was a phenomenon known as an upwelling or a boil. This occurs when water, after rushing over a submerged obstacle, wells up from the deeper water on the downstream side of that obstacle. This upwelling creates a distinctive circular, swirling pattern on the surface that looks entirely different from the general flow of the current. For a Nile sailor, Spotting one of these boils was a sure sign that a significant hazard lay hidden just upstream. The swirling water was essentially the river's signature, marking the location of a hidden sandbar or a rocky outcrop. This skill transformed their perception of the river from a flat, two-dimensional plane into a three-dimensional topographical map. They weren't just looking at the surface, they were seeing the invisible contours of the world beneath, interpreting the river's reactions to its own hidden geography. This knowledge allowed them to navigate not by what was visible, but by the effects of the invisible, a testament to their profound connection with the Nile's dynamic nature. Beyond the language of water and wind, the Nile sailors possessed another, living compass, the intricate behaviors of the animals that shared their riverine world. This was a form of bionavigation, an acute awareness that birds, reptiles, and mammals were not merely inhabitants of the landscape, but active participants in its rhythms, offering a continuous stream of real-time data to those who knew how to interpret it. The riverbank was a bustling ecosystem, and every creature, from the soaring kite to the submerged hippopotamus, became an unwitting guide, their habits meticulously observed and cataloged by generations of sailors. Birds were arguably the most valuable of these natural aids. Their perspective from the air gave them a vantage point that the earthbound sailor could only dream of, and their behavior provided clues about the wider environment. The flight patterns of certain species were particularly telling. A flock of shorebirds like plovers or sandpipers flying in a consistent, direct line low over the water often indicated they were traveling to or from a specific feeding ground, which usually meant a mud flat or a sandbank exposed by a seasonal drop in the water level. By noting the direction of their flight, a captain could infer the location of such a feature, even if it lay miles away around a bend, potentially revealing a safe channel or a hazardous shallow area. Conversely, birds circling high in the sky, such as vultures or kites, were not just searching for carrion. Their thermal soaring often signaled rising columns of warm air, which could indicate a change in wind patterns or even the presence of a large, open area like a city or a temple complex heating up in the sun, acting as a distant landmark. The timing and sounds of birds also played a role. The morning and evening movements of waterfowl, their flights from nocturnal roosts to daytime feeding areas, created predictable patterns in the sky. A sailor traveling at dawn might see lines of ducks or geese heading toward a particular marshy area, confirming his mental map of the river's smaller inlets and lagoons. The sudden, agitated calling of birds nesting in the papyrus reeds could be a sign of a predator's presence, but it could also signal the approach of another boat, its hull disturbing the quiet banks before it became visible to the sailor himself. This auditory early warning system provided a layer of situational awareness that extended beyond the immediate line of sight. On the river itself, the behavior of its most formidable residents offered a more immediate, and indeed perilous, form of navigation. Crocodiles, revered and feared, were creatures of habit. They would often bask on the same sandbanks day after day, especially those that received the best sunlight. For a sailor, a large croc sunning itself on a particular stretch of shore could become a macabre but reliable marker. He would know that just past a certain crocodile's favorite rock, the channel deepened, or that a well-known basking beach signaled an approaching fork in the river. Of course, this required a cautious approach, but the consistency of these ancient reptiles made them living, breathing buoys in a world without man-made markers. Even more critical were the hippopotamuses. While a direct encounter with a hippo was extremely dangerous for a small boat, their habits created visible pathways through the aquatic environment. Hippos are creatures of routine, following well-established trails from their daytime resting pools in deep water to their nighttime grazing grounds on shore. Over time, these repeated journeys trample clear paths through the dense papyrus and reeds along the river's edge. A sailor observing a distinct, cleared hippo path leading into the marshes would know that it indicated a connection between the deep, open river and the inland areas. More importantly, these paths often marked locations of deeper water access points, as hippos require sufficient depth to submerge their massive bodies. Spotting several of these paths in a concentrated area could signal a safe, deep water bay or a hidden channel that was otherwise concealed by the vegetation. a secret passage known only to the river's largest residents and the sailors smart enough to follow their lead. This profound connection to the animal kingdom transformed the Nile from a mere waterway into a collaborative landscape, where every creature, intentionally or not, contributed to the sailors' intricate and ever-evolving mental chart. All of this remarkable skill, however, was put to its ultimate test not during the calm, predictable months, but during the season that defined Egypt itself, the inundation. This annual event was the complete and total transformation of their world, a time when the river shrugged off its familiar banks and reclaimed the land in a vast, life-giving deluge. For the farmers on shore, this was a time of celebration and anticipation, as the floodwaters deposited the rich, black silt that would ensure the next year's harvest. But for the Nile sailor, the inundation was a period of profound disorientation and heightened danger, a complete rewriting of the navigational rules they relied upon for the rest of the year. The river they knew so intimately, with its memorized landmarks and trusted channels, simply vanished beneath a seemingly endless expanse of water. The first and most dramatic challenge was the sheer loss of visual reference. Imagine a sailor who just months before could navigate a tricky section of river by lining up a specific gnarled acacia tree with a notch in a distant cliff. Now that entire riverbank is submerged, the acacia tree might be nothing more than a few leaves sticking out of the water, and the cliff face has become a new, unfamiliar shoreline, its distinctive notch lost beneath the rising tide. The mental map, so carefully constructed over a lifetime, was suddenly rendered obsolete. The safe, deep channels that were so clear during the low water season were now invisible, their boundaries blurred by the floodwaters that spread out over the floodplain, sometimes for miles. What was once a well-defined river highway became a vast, shallow inland sea, dotted with the tops of palm groves and the mounds of villages like islands in a new archipelago. Yet, for the master navigator, this chaos was not without its order. They understood that the inundation, while dramatic, was a predictable and structured event. The floodwaters didn't rise all at once. They followed a known pattern, creeping gradually up the riverbanks over a period of weeks. This allowed for a critical period of adjustment. Experienced captains would use the initial stages of the flood to observe how the landscape was changing. They would note which landmarks were the first to be submerged and which higher ground remained visible, effectively creating a new, temporary mental map for the duration of the high water season. They knew that the fundamental geography of the riverbed still exerted its influence. The main deep channel was still there, even if it was now 40 feet underwater and a mile wide. The key was to find it. This is where their understanding of the river's permanent features became absolutely vital. While the small, low-lying landmarks were gone, the grand, immutable ones took on even greater importance. A temple complex built on high ground, like the great precinct of Ammon at Karnak, became a colossal navigational beacon, a lone mountain peak in the distance, which might have been just a scenic backdrop during the dry season, now served as a crucial fixed point for taking bearings. The most skilled pilots would use a technique called ranging, or lining up two distant, permanent features that remained above the waterline. By carefully steering so that a particular temple pylon stayed perfectly aligned with a specific peak on the horizon, a captain could trace a straight line across the flooded landscape that he knew corresponded to the path of the old, deep channel. He was essentially navigating by the tops of the world, using the high points of the landscape to guide him through the drowned world below. The inundation also presented a unique opportunity that state planners and ambitious captains eagerly exploited: the movement of massive cargo. While the flooded river was treacherous for the uninitiated, its dramatically increased depth was a gift for heavy transport. During the low water season, a ship carrying a 200-ton obelisk or a colossal granite statue might be confined to the very deepest parts of the channel, a slow and precarious journey requiring constant sounding. But when the inundation reached its peak, the entire river became a deep water highway. These gargantuan vessels, which were essentially floating platforms, could now travel routes that were completely impassable for most of the year. They could take more direct paths, cutting across areas that were normally sandbars or floodplain, significantly shortening journey times for the most critical state projects. The inundation was the window for grand ambition, the only time when the stones for a new pharaoh's pyramid or the columns for a great temple could be moved with relative ease. This seasonal shift also demanded a complete change in the types of vessels used. The great wooden cargo ships with their deep drafts were the kings of the high water period. But as the floodwaters began to recede, a different fleet took to the water. The humble, nimble papyrus skiffs and small wooden boats, which were of little use in the deep, powerful currents of the peak flood, now came into their own. These shallow draft craft could navigate the newly exposed marshlands and the shrinking channels that the large ships could no longer access. They became essential for local trade, for fishing in the receding pools, and for transporting people and goods between villages that were still partially isolated by the remnants of the flood. The rhythm of Egyptian navigation was, therefore, a seasonal dance between different technologies, each perfectly adapted to the river's changing mood. Ultimately, a sailor's ability to adapt to the inundation was the true mark of their mastery. It required a flexible mind, one that could hold two different maps of the same space, the detailed, intricate map of the low-water river and the broader, more strategic map of the flooded world. It demanded a profound trust in the cyclical nature of their universe. They knew the waters would rise, and they knew with equal certainty that they would recede. This wasn't a catastrophe to be feared, but a cycle to be understood and mastered. The inundation didn't break their system of navigation. It was the ultimate examination of it, a yearly test that separated those who merely knew the river from those who truly understood its soul. This deep, cyclical understanding of the river's moods was so precise that it became the very framework for measuring time itself. The ancient Egyptians didn't just observe the inundation, they built their entire calendar around its miraculous predictability. This wasn't a system of arbitrary months. It was a direct reflection of the Nile's life cycle, divided into 3 distinct seasons that governed every aspect of society, and for our sailors, dictated the very rhythm of their voyages. The year began with Akhet, the season of the inundation, when the river overflowed its banks and transformed the land. This was followed by Perit, the coming forth of the land from the waters, when the flood receded and the planting could begin. Finally, there was Shemu, the harvest season, a time of intense labor and abundance before the waters would rise once more. For the captain planning a journey, this calendar was not an abstract concept, but the most critical logbook imaginable. The timing of a voyage was everything, and the season of Akhet presented a tantalizing paradox. While the flooded river was wide, disorienting, and hid its familiar landmarks, it also offered an unparalleled opportunity for ambitious state-sponsored missions. This was the only time of year when the water was deep enough to float the most colossal cargoes. A captain entrusted with transporting granite obelisks or the massive limestone blocks for a new temple would schedule this journey for the peak of the flood. The risks were high navigating by the distant hills and temple pylons alone, but the reward was the ability to move weights that were simply impossible during the drier months. The river became a superhighway, allowing these giant barges to take more direct routes across what was normally floodplain. Conversely, for local trade or travel between riverside villages, Akhet could be a time of isolation and difficulty, as the widespread waters made many familiar landing spots inaccessible. As the waters receded and Perit began, the nature of navigation shifted dramatically. The river slowly returned to its main channel, revealing the new layers of fertile black silt on its banks. For the sailor, this was a period of refamiliarization. The submerged landmarks began to reemerge, and the deep channels became more defined once again. This was an excellent time for routine travel and trade. The water levels were still respectably high, making passage relatively easy, but the river's boundaries were clear, reducing the navigational hazards of the full flood. Voyages could be planned with greater certainty, and the movement of standard goods, grain, pottery, linen, would have picked up significantly as communities reconnected after the isolating months of Akhet. The sailor's mental map, temporarily adjusted for the flood, was now being meticulously updated with the river's new, post-inundation contours. Shemu, the harvest season, brought the most challenging conditions for navigation. Under the scorching summer sun, the river was at its lowest and slowest. The main channel narrowed, and the hidden sandbanks became more numerous and perilous. This was not the time for attempting to move massive stones or for undertaking long, ambitious voyages against a weakened current. Instead, it was a season for caution, for local knowledge, and for the agile, shallow draft papyrus skiffs that could navigate the shrunken waterways. Yet, this period was also perfectly aligned with the powerful Etesian winds. So while downstream travel with the current was sluggish, a journey south could be efficiently powered by sail, harnessing the steady northerly breeze to combat the languid flow. A clever captain would use Shemu for southbound missions, relying on the wind to compensate for the river's low energy, demonstrating how the master sailor always worked with the complete seasonal picture, never relying on a single factor. But this was never just a matter of practical logistics. The entire cycle was sacred, a divine drama playing out on a yearly schedule. The Egyptians believed the inundation was caused by the tears of the goddess Isis mourning her husband Osiris, or by the direct intervention of Hapy, the god of the Nile's fertile flood. The success of a voyage was therefore not solely in the hands of the captain. It depended on the favor of the gods. Before setting out, particularly on an important state mission, rituals and offerings would be made to appease Hapy and ensure a safe and timely journey. The calendar itself was a religious document, and to sail in accordance with it was to participate in a divine order. A journey during Akhit was a collaboration with the gods of the flood. A voyage in Perit was a celebration of the earth's rebirth. Travel in Shemu was an act of endurance under the eye of the sun god Ra. This sacred connection elevated the sailor's role from mere transporter to a participant in the cosmic cycle. His ability to read the seasons, to understand the intentions of the river as expressed through the gods, made him a vital link between the human world and the divine. When he successfully navigated the floodwaters, he was demonstrating piety as much as skill, showing that he understood and respected the power of the deities that controlled the water. This intertwining of practical navigation and religious belief created a profound sense of purpose. Each safely completed voyage was not just a commercial success, it was a reaffirmation of Maat, the fundamental order of the universe, a harmony between humanity, nature, and the gods. The river was a living, divine entity, and the sailor, with his calendar and his skills, was its faithful and knowledgeable companion. For the Nile sailor, every successful journey was a testament to more than mere skill, it was evidence of divine favor. The science of reading the stars and the river was seamlessly interwoven with a profound spiritual belief system, where the forces of nature were not random occurrences, but the direct actions of gods who demanded respect and supplication. Navigation, in its entirety, was a sacred act, a collaboration between human ingenuity and celestial will. Before a vessel even left its moorings, the captain and crew would engage in rituals to secure the protection of specific deities whose domains governed the unpredictable elements they were about to face. The most vital of these was Hapy, the god of the annual inundation. He was not a distant, aloof figure, but the very personification of the life-giving flood. Represented as a portly, androgynous figure with heavy breasts and a headdress of papyrus and lotus plants, Hapy symbolized the fertility and abundance that the Nile's rise brought to the land. For a sailor, a successful voyage depended entirely on Hapy's mood. A well-timed, predictable flood meant deep, navigable channels for the heavy cargo ships. A weak or erratic inundation meant treacherous shallows and economic disaster. Offerings to Hapy libations of water, milk, or beer, or the presentation of choice fruits were essential to ensure his benevolence, not just for the farmers in the fields, but for the men whose livelihoods moved upon his waters. Equally important was the goddess Isis, whose domain extended far beyond her roles as a magical healer and devoted wife. She held a direct and measurable influence over the river itself through her connection to the star Sirius, known to the Egyptians as Sopdet. The heliacal rising of Sirius, its first reappearance in the dawn sky after a 70-day period of invisibility, was the most anxiously awaited celestial event of the year. This phenomenon, which occurred in mid-July, coincided almost perfectly with the beginning of the Nile's rise. The Egyptians saw this not as a simple correlation, but as a cause. They believed the tears of Isis, mourning her murdered husband Osiris, caused the river to overflow its banks, and the brilliant star Sirius was seen as the celestial embodiment of the goddess. For the sailor, the appearance of Sopdet was a divine signal, a call to action broadcast from the heavens. It marked the official start of the new year and the opening of the most critical season for navigation. Rituals honoring Isis and Sopdet would have been widespread, with sailors undoubtedly offering prayers of thanks for the coming flood and petitions for her guiding light, both celestial and metaphorical, during the perilous journeys of the months ahead. The pantheon of protection did not end there. The sun god Ra was a constant companion on any daytime voyage. His daily journey across the sky in his solar bark was the ultimate model for all river travel. Egyptian sailors saw their own ships as earthly reflections of Ra's divine vessel, and they sought his protection from the dangers of the day, just as he safely navigated the perils of the underworld each night. For journeys after sunset, the moon god Khonsu, known as the Navigator, became a crucial guide. His changing phases provided a nightly timepiece, helping sailors track the passage of hours during the long, dark vigils at the helm. Then, there was the fearsome god Seth, the deity of chaos, storms, and violence. While generally feared, he was also respected as a power that needed to be appeased. A sudden squall, a treacherous, unexpected current, or an encounter with a hostile river creature could all be attributed to Seth's disruptive influence. Small, propitiatory offerings might be made to Seth not for his blessing, but to avert his malice, a pragmatic spiritual insurance policy against the chaotic dangers that could strike without warning. These beliefs were translated into tangible actions through specific rituals performed at key moments in a voyage. Before departure, a ceremony at the riverbank was likely commonplace. The captain, acting as a priest for his crew, might pour a libation of water or wine into the Nile as an offering to Hapy. Incense, often frankincense or myrrh, would be burned, its fragrant smoke carrying prayers for safe passage up to the gods. Amulets were a sailor's personal lifeline to the divine. Small charms made of faience, stone, or metal, depicting protective symbols like the Eye of Horus, the Ankh, or the Jed Pillar, would be worn or carried on board. These were not mere decorations. They were believed to be imbued with real power, offering a layer of spiritual armor against the physical and supernatural dangers of the river. The very ship itself might have been considered a sacred space, with protective spells or the names of gods painted on the hull or carved into the mast, turning the vessel into a consecrated object for its journey. This fusion of practical skill and deep faith created a powerful, holistic worldview for the ancient sailor. He did not see a conflict between using a sounding pole to check the depth and praying to Hapy for deep water. Both actions were part of a single, continuous effort to ensure a safe journey. A favorable wind was both a meteorological event and a breath of divine grace. A successful star sighting was both precise astronomy and a moment of communion with the gods who sailed those same celestial waters. This spiritual dimension provided more than just comfort. It offered a framework for understanding success and failure. A voyage that ended safely was a sign that the rituals had been performed correctly and the gods were pleased. A ship lost to a storm or a sandbank was not just a navigational error. It could be interpreted as a failure to appease a particular deity or an inescapable act of divine will. This sacred approach to navigation infused their dangerous profession with meaning and purpose, connecting every turn of the river, every shift of the wind, and every star in the sky to a grand cosmic order that they were privileged to participate in with every journey they undertook. To truly appreciate the captain's role, we must move beyond the image of a simple helmsman shouting orders. This individual was the living, breathing database of the entire Nile navigation system, a custodian of secrets so vital to the state that his knowledge was considered almost sacred. His authority on the ship was absolute, but it was an authority earned through a lifetime of absorbing a vast and complex curriculum that blended hard science with spiritual wisdom. He was part astronomer, part meteorologist, part hydrologist, and part priest, his mind a repository for everything needed to coax a safe passage from the powerful and often unpredictable river. The foundation of his practical knowledge was, of course, the river itself. He held a mental map of the Nile that was astonishing in its detail, a living chart updated with every voyage. He knew not just the major landmarks, but the personality of every bend and current. He could recall a specific submerged rock near Thebes that was only a threat when the water level dropped below a certain point, or a deceptive stretch of water near Memphis where the main channel narrowed abruptly. This was more than simple memorization. It was an intuitive understanding of the river's hydrology. He knew how spring floods from distant highlands would alter the current days before the water even arrived, and he could predict where new sandbars were likely to form after a period of strong wind. This deep, localized knowledge was his primary tool, the first line of defense against the river's ever-changing nature. But his gaze was not fixed solely on the water. His understanding of the celestial sphere was as critical as his knowledge of the riverbed. He was a master astronomer, able to identify not only the pole star and major constellations, but also dozens of lesser stars and their precise movements throughout the night. This was not abstract learning, it was a practical skill for dead reckoning and timekeeping. He knew that when the star we call Sirius rose just before the sun, the inundation was near. He could glance at the position of the Big Dipper relative to the horizon and estimate how many hours of darkness remained, a crucial calculation for deciding whether to press on or seek a safe mooring. This cosmic literacy allowed him to navigate the featureless desert nights with a confidence that would seem like magic to an outsider. His expertise extended to the very air they breathed. The captain was a keen meteorologist, interpreting signs in the sky and on the water to forecast the weather hours or even days in advance. He knew that a halo around the moon often foretold rain, unlikely as it was in Egypt, or a change in wind. He understood that a certain quality of haze on the western horizon at sunset could signal the arrival of a strong northerly wind the next day, perfect for a southbound journey. He could read the subtle shifts in air pressure on his skin and interpret the flight patterns of birds as indicators of coming storms or calm. This ability to anticipate the weather was not just a matter of convenience, it was a matter of survival, allowing him to avoid being caught on open water in a sudden squall or to capitalize on a favorable breeze that could save his crew days of arduous towing. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the captain's knowledge was its secretive and esoteric nature. This is not public information found on any papyrus scroll. It was a closely guarded body of lore, a professional secret passed down through generations within families, or from a master to a carefully chosen apprentice. The process of learning was a form of oral tradition, a long and intimate apprenticeship. A young boy destined for command would spend years on the river with his father or uncle, not just performing chores but being relentlessly quizzed. What does that pattern of ripples mean? Which star will be highest in the sky at midnight 2 moons from now? Recite the sequence of landmarks between Elephantine and Edfu. This knowledge was often encoded in songs, chants, and rhyming couplets, making the vast amounts of information easier to memorize and recall under pressure. This secrecy served a vital purpose. In an economy where the state's power depended on the efficient movement of goods and armies, a skilled captain was a strategic asset. His knowledge was a form of power and prestige, ensuring his employment and high status. If everyone possessed the secrets of navigating the inundation or reading the most subtle stellar cues, his unique value would diminish. By keeping this knowledge within a select group, these masters of the river maintained their indispensable role in Egyptian society. They were the guardians of a tradition that enabled the pharaohs to project their power and feed their people, making the captain's role not just a job, but a sacred trust handed down from one generation of river masters to the next. Given the sheer sophistication of their navigation, a natural question arises. Did these master sailors possess physical maps to guide their way? The evidence presents a fascinating puzzle. To date, archaeologists have unearthed no surviving nautical chart from ancient Egypt that resembles the detailed Portolan maps of later eras. There is no papyrus scroll marked with coastlines, depths, and harbors. This absence, however, does not mean they navigated blindly. Instead, The Egyptians seem to have developed a unique and highly effective system of wayfinding that relied less on paper charts and more on a different kind of map, one that was lived, memorized, and deeply embedded in the culture itself. The closest we come to an ancient Egyptian map of the river is often found in a symbolic, rather than a practical, context. Tombs of nobles and officials, particularly from the New Kingdom, sometimes feature beautiful painted scenes depicting the deceased standing in a skiff, gliding through papyrus marshes teeming with fish and birds. While these are idealized visions of the afterlife, they often include remarkably accurate depictions of the river's flora and fauna. More importantly, we find schematic representations of the world in certain papyri, like the famous map of the gold mines from the reign of Ramesses VI. This document shows routes through the eastern desert, featuring mountains, roads, and mining settlements relative to each other. It proves the Egyptians were perfectly capable of creating diagrammatic representations of geography for administrative purposes. If they could map the desert, it is entirely plausible that they created similar schematic guides for the river, perhaps marking distances between major cities, the locations of important temples, or the safest channels through known hazardous stretches. The most likely medium for such practical charts would have been papyrus or scraped leather, both highly perishable materials. A papyrus map would have been incredibly fragile, exposed to sun, water, and wear on a rocking ship. It would have been a working document, used until it fell apart and then replaced by a new copy. This constant use and replacement would explain why no examples have survived in the archaeological record. We can imagine a captain unrolling a small, schematic leather scroll, not to see a realistic drawing of the river's twists and turns, but to consult a list or a simple line drawing. This chart might have shown the journey from Memphis to Thebes as a straight line marked with symbolic icons for major landmarks: a pyramid here, a temple pylon there with notations for the number of days travel between each point. It would have been a memory aid, a checklist to be used in concert with the captain's vast internalized knowledge, not a replacement for it. This leads us to the most compelling theory that the primary and most reliable map was not made of papyrus at all, but was etched into the mind of the master navigator. The mental map of an experienced Nile captain was a living, three-dimensional construct, far more detailed and dynamic than any static drawing could ever be. It was a multi-sensory database. He didn't just know that a certain bend in the river came after 3 days of sailing from the last major city. He knew the sound the current made as it swept around that bend. He knew the smell of the air near a particular marshland, the feel of the wind as it changed direction past a specific cliff, and the exact taste of the silt in the water at a given location. This mental map was continuously updated with every voyage, incorporating the changes brought by each annual inundation, each new sandbank, each seasonally shifting current. The transmission of this knowledge was the true cartography of ancient Egypt. It was passed down through an intensive oral tradition from captain to apprentice, often from father to son, over many years. This process was how the charts were copied and preserved. A young sailor would learn chants and songs that served as auditory maps. A long, rhythmic poem might describe the entire journey from the delta to the first cataract, listing landmarks in sequence. By memorizing the song, the apprentice was memorizing the route. The elder captain would point out each feature as they passed it, associating the abstract words of the chant with the tangible reality of the riverbank, forging an unbreakable link between sound, sight, and memory. This method was incredibly robust. A papyrus map could be lost or destroyed, but a song stored in the mind of a skilled navigator was impervious to the elements, ensuring the survival of critical navigational knowledge for generations. Therefore, the question of whether they had maps depends entirely on our definition. If we mean precise, scaled diagrams on parchment, the answer is probably no, or at least none that survived the millennia. But if we expand our definition to include sophisticated systems for recording and transmitting geographic information, then the answer is a definitive yes. Their maps were a hybrid technology, perhaps simple, perishable schematics used as aids, combined with an incredibly rich and detailed oral tradition that turned human memory into a living, breathing atlas. This system was perfectly adapted to their environment. It was flexible, allowing for constant revision as the river changed. It was secure, keeping vital state secrets within a specialized guild. And it was profoundly resilient, ensuring that the knowledge of how to navigate the lifeblood of Egypt could flow as uninterrupted as the Nile itself, from one generation of river masters to the next. This mastery of the river, so vital for trade and unity, found its most dramatic and decisive application in the realm of warfare. The Nile was not merely a highway for commerce, it was the central nervous system of Egyptian military power, a liquid battlefield where control of the currents could mean the difference between a triumphant empire and a conquered nation. The pharaohs understood that he who commanded the river commanded Egypt itself, and they leveraged the sailors' hard-won navigation secrets to project force with a speed and precision that their land-bound enemies could scarcely comprehend. The ability to move an army of thousands, along with its supplies and siege equipment, over hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks, was a logistical miracle that gave the Egyptian army an overwhelming strategic advantage. The core of this advantage was the sheer speed of strategic deployment. Consider the challenge of moving an army from the capital in the north to crush a rebellion near the southern border, a distance of over 400 miles. A force marching on foot through the arid desert would be slowed by heat, limited water supplies, and the sheer exhaustion of the soldiers. That same army, embarked on a fleet of transport ships, could travel with the current and a favorable wind, covering 30 to 40 miles in a single day with the soldiers resting in the shade of the sail. This wasn't just a matter of convenience, it was a game changer. An enemy leader, calculating that an army was many weeks away, could be caught completely off guard when the royal fleet appeared on the horizon just days after news of the revolt had even reached the capital. This rapid response capability allowed the pharaohs to maintain a tight grip on their long, narrow kingdom, ensuring that local dissent could be snuffed out before it had time to flare into a major conflagration. This strategic mobility enabled one of the most feared tactics in the Egyptian arsenal, the riverborne surprise attack. An army marching across the desert raised a massive dust cloud visible for miles, giving defenders ample time to prepare. But an army moving by ship was eerily silent and virtually invisible until the last moment. A fleet could travel by night, guided by the stars, and silently coast with the current at dawn to materialize before an enemy settlement. The first warning the defenders might have would be the sight of sails rounding the nearest river bend, or the sound of warships beaching simultaneously at multiple points along the shore. This tactic allowed Egyptian forces to achieve tactical shock, landing troops behind enemy lines or striking at undefended sections of a city's riverfront before the garrison could reorganize. The psychological impact was devastating. The river, a source of life, was suddenly transformed into a conduit of death, bringing the pharaoh's wrath from an unexpected direction. Beyond swift strikes, the Nile was the ultimate tool for controlling the battlefield through blockades and supply line dominance. A key strategic objective in any campaign was to secure the river itself. By positioning a fleet of warships at a narrow point in the valley, the Egyptians could effectively cut the enemy's lines of communication and supply. They could prevent rival forces from crossing the river to reinforce each other, isolate rebellious cities from receiving food and water, and intercept enemy cargo ships attempting to bring in provisions. This naval blockade was often more effective than a direct assault. A city under siege might hold out for months against a land army if it had access to the river, but with the waterway controlled by Egyptian warships, its fate was virtually sealed. The ability to strangle an enemy into submission without losing a single soldier in a costly frontal attack was a clear demonstration of how controlling the logistical network was as important as winning pitched battles. To enforce this control, the Egyptians developed specialized warships distinct from their cargo vessels. While they used robust transport ships to ferry troops, the true instruments of river dominance were sleek, purpose-built galleys. Archaeological evidence and tomb reliefs depict long, narrow vessels powered primarily by banks of oarsmen, providing the speed and maneuverability needed for combat. Unlike the broad, stable cargo ships, these warships had a shallow draft, allowing them to operate close to shore and in narrower channels. Their most distinctive feature was a high, reinforced prow, often decorated with a fearsome animal head, like a lion or a crocodile. This wasn't just for show, it functioned as a ram, designed to smash into the hulls of enemy boats or to crash down onto the decks of smaller vessels during an attack. These ships were floating fortresses, carrying contingents of archers and marines, highly trained infantry, who would board enemy vessels or lead amphibious assaults on the riverbanks. The coordination of these complex military operations fell, once again, to the master captains. Their navigational skills were now applied to tactical problems. They had to know the river well enough to maneuver a fleet in tight formation, to find hidden coves where ships could lie in ambush, and to identify landing beaches that could support the rapid disembarkation of hundreds of soldiers. The same skill used to sense a hidden sandbank was now used to avoid underwater obstacles that could cripple a warship during a chase. The ability to read the wind was crucial for positioning the fleet to gain an advantage. A captain who could put his archers upwind of the enemy, for example, could give their arrows greater range while the enemy's shots fell short. In the heat of a river battle, the captain's role transformed from a guide to a battlefield commander, his knowledge of the water becoming as critical as a general's knowledge of the terrain. The silent, forgotten art of the Nile sailor thus became the unsung backbone of pharaonic power, their intimate conversation with the river echoing in the clash of arms and the triumph of empire. But this military power, the ability to project force across vast distances, was ultimately built upon an even more fundamental pillar: economic strength. The pharaoh's army could only sail so effectively because the river was already teeming with a constant, silent armada of merchant vessels, the true lifeblood of the empire. The navigational mastery we have been exploring was not developed for conquest alone. Its primary purpose was to fuel a trade network of breathtaking scale and sophistication. The Nile was ancient Egypt's economic superhighway, a liquid conveyor belt that transformed raw materials into monumental architecture and local harvests into imperial wealth. This was where the sailors' skill directly translated into the pharaoh's power, moving the very resources that defined a civilization. The scope of this commercial activity was staggering, and it followed a clear, logical flow dictated by geography. The major trade routes essentially mirrored the river's own course, creating a north-south axis of economic exchange that held the kingdom together. From the resource-rich lands of Nubia, far to the south, came the most coveted treasure of all, gold. The pharaoh's insatiable demand for this precious metal, essential for adorning temples, statues, and royal burial masks, was met by mines in the desolate mountains of Upper Nubia. Getting this gold to the workshops of Memphis or Thebes was a monumental logistical challenge. It would be transported down the Nile on specialized cargo ships, heavily guarded and expertly navigated through the treacherous cataracts, those rocky rapids that mark the borderlands. Each successful voyage south to collect tribute and return north with a fortune in gold dust and ingots was a direct result of the sailors' ability to conquer the upstream current and safely navigate back down. But the river's bounty was not limited to glittering metal. From the quarries at Aswan, located just north of the first cataract, came another form of immense weight and value: granite. This hard, durable stone was the material of choice for obelisks, colossal statues, and the inner chambers of pyramids. Transporting a single 100-ton obelisk was a feat of engineering that is impressive even by modern standards. A specially built barge, a flat-bottomed giant of a ship, would be maneuvered against the current to the quarry. Once the obelisk was painstakingly loaded, the journey downstream began. The captain's expertise was paramount here. He had to ensure his vessel, now incredibly heavy and unwieldy, stayed perfectly centered in the deepest part of the channel. A single mistake, a grounding on a sandbank, could mean disaster, shattering the priceless monument and dooming the project. The successful delivery of these stones to riverbank temples was a public demonstration of the state's logistical prowess, a moving mountain of stone made possible by water and wisdom. Flowing in the opposite direction, from the fertile fields of the north to the administrative centers and arid south, was the true staple of the Egyptian economy: grain. The rich black silt deposited by the annual inundation made the Nile Delta and the floodplain incredibly productive, generating massive surpluses of emmer wheat and barley. This grain was the primary form of tax revenue for the state. Scribes would meticulously record harvests, and then the vast fleet of cargo ships would swing into action. These ships, broader and with a greater capacity than the stone-carrying barges, would be loaded with sacks of grain at riverside granaries. Their mission was to sail south, delivering this essential food supplied to the soldiers stationed at border forts, the laborers building royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, and the populations of cities that cannot produce enough food locally. This system of redistribution, entirely dependent on river transport, acted as a massive insurance policy against local famines and allowed for the support of a large, non-farming population of priests, officials, and artisans. Beyond these bulk commodities, the Nile was also a conduit for luxury goods that defined elite status and fueled international diplomacy. From the Mediterranean ports in the north, ships brought in coveted items like olive oil from Crete, fine pottery from Greece, and the magnificent cedar wood from Lebanon that was essential for building the finest ships and temple doors. From the south, beyond Nubia, came exotic goods from the heart of Africa: ivory from elephant tusks, ebony wood, exotic animal skins, and fragrant resins like myrrh and frankincense. These luxuries were not just for royal pleasure, they were strategic tools. The pharaohs used them as gifts to secure the loyalty of provincial governors, as offerings to the gods to ensure divine favor, and as diplomatic gifts to foreign powers, showcasing the wealth and reach of Egypt. The sailor navigating a ship laden with such treasures carried more than cargo. He carried the soft power of the state. The organization behind this economic machine was highly centralized. This was not a free market in the modern sense, but a state-controlled enterprise. The royal court, through its viziers and officials, owned the major cargo fleets, managed the warehouses and granaries along the river, and employed the master captains directly. A successful captain in charge of a royal shipment was a key civil servant. His navigational skill directly influenced the economic health of the nation. A fast, efficient voyage meant grain reached a hungry city on time, or that a new temple could be completed swiftly, enhancing the pharaoh's prestige. Delays caused by poor navigation or a failure to read the river's signs could have cascading effects, disrupting supply chains and potentially causing unrest. The economic power of Egypt was therefore not just a product of its natural resources, but of its human capital, the generations of sailors who had mastered the art of turning a flowing river into a disciplined, predictable, and immensely powerful engine of trade. Their silent, constant work on the water built the pyramids, fed the cities, and clothed the gods, making them the indispensable architects of pharaonic wealth. Imagine the constant, low roar of the mighty river, the rush of the current against the hull, the flap of the great linen sail, the rhythmic splash of oars, and the shouted chants of a towing team 100 strong on the bank. In this cacophony of natural and human effort, clear communication over distance was not just a matter of convenience, it was a critical component of safety and coordination. Without the technology of radios or loudspeakers, Nile sailors developed a sophisticated auditory language, a system of signals and calls that cut through the noise to convey vital information instantly across the water. This was a world where sound was as important as sight, where a specific sequence of whistle blasts could prevent a collision, and a well-understood horn pattern could save a ship from running aground. The most immediate and personal form of this communication was the human voice, honed and projected with the skill of a stage actor. Commands were not simply yelled, they were delivered in a distinct, rhythmic chant that carried over the wind and water. The leader of the towing team, for example, would not just shout, "Heave." He would sing out a long, melodic call, its rhythm synchronizing the pull of every man on the rope. This chant allowed the team to exert force in a unified, explosive motion, turning individual effort into a powerful, collective action. The tone and cadence of these chants were standardized, so that even a new crew member would recognize the call to pull, ease, hold fast. On board the ship, the captain's commands to the helmsman at the great steering oar needed to be short, sharp, and unmistakable. Words like port, starboard, steady, and hard over would be barked with a clarity that brooked no misunderstanding, the tone of voice conveying the urgency of the situation. A calm and measured command indicated a routine course adjustment, while a short, sharp shout signaled an immediate danger requiring instant reaction. For communication over greater distances, between ships in a convoy or from a vessel to its distant towing team, the voice alone was insufficient. This is where simple yet effective instruments came into play. A common tool across many ancient maritime cultures was the conch shell, and it is highly plausible the Egyptians used a similar device. A deep, resonant blast from a large shell or an animal horn could travel for miles over flat water, its low frequency cutting through the ambient noise far better than a human voice. These horn blasts would have followed a coded system, much like a primitive Morse code. One long blast might signal stop or attention. Two short, sharp blasts could mean danger ahead, alerting the following ships in a line to slow down or change course. Three rapid blasts might indicate man overboard, or another emergency requiring immediate assistance from nearby vessels. This allowed a lead ship to communicate hazards like a submerged log or a shifting sandbank to the entire fleet without any visual contact, a crucial early warning system that relied on sound alone. Perhaps the most intricate and specialized form of auditory signaling was reserved for the complex and dangerous process of towing a heavy vessel upstream. Coordinating the efforts of the men on the bank with the crew on the ship, especially when navigating a bend in the river or avoiding an obstacle, required a precise, real-time dialogue. It is easy to imagine a system of whistles being used for this purpose. A lookout stationed at the bow of the ship, with a clear view of the river ahead and the towing path on the bank, might have used a simple reed or bone whistle. A single high-pitched tweet could signal the towman to pull, while two tweets might mean ease. A rapid series of tweets could be the signal for stop immediately, perhaps because a lookout has spotted a crocodile on the bank or a sudden, treacherous patch of water ahead. The tow team leader might have carried a whistle of a different pitch to communicate back to the ship, creating a two-way conversation that ensured the safety of both the men on the rope and the valuable cargo on the boat. This lost language of sound extended beyond simple commands to encompass the entire social fabric of life on the river. The sound themselves became a form of community identification. The distinct rhythm of a particular captain's command chant or the unique tone of a ship's horn might have been as recognizable as a livery or a flag, signaling the approach of a specific merchant family's vessel or a royal ship long before it was close enough to see clearly. The auditory environment of the Nile was therefore a rich tapestry of information. The shrieking cry of a kite circling overhead might blend with the deep blast of a horn from a downriver barge, the rhythmic chant of a towing team, and the sharp whistle of a pilot guiding his ship into a crowded landing. For the experienced sailor, this symphony of sound was not noise. It was a continuous stream of data, a vital layer of communication that enabled the silent, seamless operation of the fleet that sustained a civilization, proving that on the ancient Nile, sometimes the most important thing was not what you could see, but what you could hear. Now, let's cast our minds into the profound stillness of an Egyptian night, where the bustling river traffic of daylight has faded and the world is reduced to the soft lap of water against the hull and a sky ablaze with stars. The decision to voyage after sunset was not taken lightly. It was a calculated risk, a strategic choice that balanced significant advantages against very real perils. For the ancient sailor, the cover of darkness offered a powerful reprieve from the relentless desert sun. Traveling during the cooler night hours conserved the energy of the crew immensely, whether they were manning the oars or managing the heavy sail. This was a critical consideration on long journeys, as it reduced the risk of heat exhaustion and dehydration. Furthermore, for military movements, darkness was the ultimate ally. A fleet could glide almost silently downriver, its approach hidden until the last possible moment, achieving complete tactical surprise against an unsuspecting enemy settlement at dawn. Yet, the dangers were ever present and formidable. The river's most treacherous features, the shifting sandbanks, the submerged rocks, the snags of fallen trees, became invisible hunters in the dark. A channel that was easily navigable by day could become a death trap by night. The loss of all visual reference to the riverbanks meant a captain could easily drift unknowingly into shallow water or onto a mudflat. The threat of collision with another vessel, though rare given the vastness of the river, was another concern. Because of these risks, night travel was likely reserved for specific circumstances, clear moonlit nights on well-known stretches of river, or when the strategic need for speed or secrecy outweighed the hazards. It was the domain of the most experienced captains, those whose knowledge of the heavens and the river's voice was absolute. Their primary guidance system under the stars was, of course, the celestial map we discussed earlier. The pole star served as their true north, but night voyaging required a more dynamic and continuous form of stellar navigation known as steering by a transit. A captain would select two bright stars that rose or set in a line parallel to the stretch of river he was traveling. By carefully aligning these two celestial bodies, keeping one star directly above the other as they moved across the sky, he could maintain a perfectly straight course down the center of the channel for many miles. This technique required an intimate familiarity with the night sky's rotation, a living knowledge of how each constellation would shift its position hour by hour. It was a skill of breathtaking precision, turning the abstract beauty of the cosmos into a practical, reliable autopilot. But the stars alone could not illuminate the immediate dangers lurking just below the surface. For this, they turned to artificial light, though its use was limited and strategic. Small oil lamps, fueled by castor oil or animal fat, would have been placed at key points on the ship. These were not powerful searchlights capable of piercing the deep darkness. Their glow was faint and localized. A lamp might be hung at the bow, not so much to light the way ahead, but to create a small pool of light around the vessel itself. This allowed the crew to see the water directly alongside the hull, to spot any floating debris, and to monitor the ship's rigging. Crucially, it provided just enough light for the sailor with the sounding pole to see the depth markings as he continuously probed the riverbed ahead, his rhythmic calls of 4 cubits. Or 2 cubits, cutting through the quiet night to guide the helmsman. Perhaps the most fascinating adaptation for night travel was the heightened reliance on the sense of sound. When sight was diminished, the river spoke a different language, and the sailors became expert listeners. The sound of the current itself changed depending on the depth and the riverbed's composition. The rush of water over a gravelly bottom produced a different whisper than its flow over soft mud, but the most critical auditory cues came from the riverbanks. On a quiet night, the sound of the wind rustling through the reeds or the distant calls of nocturnal animals on the shore could act as a sonic landmark. A skilled captain or a dedicated listener at the bow could gauge the ship's distance from the bank by the volume and direction of these sounds. If the cacophony of frogs from a marsh suddenly grew louder on the port side, it was a clear indicator that the current was pushing them too close to that shore, prompting a gentle correction of the steering oar to return to the safety of the channel center. In the profound blackness of a moonless night, this ability to navigate by ear transformed the invisible world into a navigable space, a testament to their deep, multisensory connection to the river they called home. While the Nile's flow through the heart of Egypt was a challenge mastered by generations of sailors, to the south lay a far more formidable arena, a river transformed from a predictable highway into a raging, rock-strewn gauntlet. This was the domain of the Nubian and Upper Egyptian sailors, individuals who hone a completely different set of skills to conquer the river's most violent stretches, the cataract. These were not gentle rapids, but a series of 6 major rocky barriers where the Nile, forced through narrow channels of hard granite, exploded into a chaos of whitewater, whirlpools, and submerged boulders. For any ship hoping to travel beyond the traditional border of Egypt at the first cataract near Aswan, navigating these zones was a life-or-death undertaking that demanded a level of localized expertise so profound it became a state secret. The challenge of the cataracts was fundamentally different from sailing the open river. It wasn't about reading subtle currents or navigating by the stars. It was about raw, immediate survival in a maelstrom of water and stone. A captain's deep knowledge of the placid stretches was useless here. Instead, he needed an intimate, foot-by-foot memorization of the cataract's specific topography. He had to know which seemingly innocuous patch of churning water hit a car-sized rock just inches below the surface. He needed to identify the one safe channel, often no wider than the ship itself, that snaked through the turmoil. This knowledge was not gained from a single daring voyage. It was accumulated over a lifetime of observation, passed down through families who lived in the very shadow of these roaring waterfalls. These pilots were the only ones who could see the hidden pathways in the apparent chaos. The technique they perfected, known informally as shooting the rapids, was a breathtaking display of courage and precision. It was the polar opposite of the careful, measured progress used on the calm river. When approaching a cataract heading downstream, the goal was not to fight the current, but to surrender to it strategically. The captain would position his vessel at the very head of the correct channel. Then, with a decisive command, the crew would ship their oars, and the ship would be committed, caught in the river's powerful grip, and propelled forward at a terrifying speed. The captain's role now was that of a master helmsman, using the massive steering oars not for subtle course corrections, but for violent, last-second adjustments to bounce the vessel off the sides of safe rocks, using them as bumpers to avoid the lethal ones. It was a controlled crash through nature's obstacle course, a heart-pounding ride where a single miscalculation meant the ship being dashed to splinters against the unyielding granite. For the arduous journey upstream, the process was even more grueling and technically complex. There was no question of sailing or even rowing against the torrential force of the cataract. Instead, it became a monumental feat of human engineering. The ship would be unloaded entirely, its cargo carried along the bank by porters. Then, using a network of heavy ropes made from woven papyrus and leather, teams of hundreds of men would physically haul the empty vessel through the raging waters. This was an operation of immense coordination. Teams on the bank would pull from ahead, while crews wading chest deep in the churning water or using smaller auxiliary boats would fend the hull away from rocks with long poles. The sound would have been deafening, the roar of the water mixed with the synchronized shouts of the hauling teams, straining against the immense drag. It was a slow, dangerous, and exhausting process, but it was the only way to move ships beyond these natural barriers, making the cataract pilots the gatekeepers to the riches of the Deep South. This specialized skill set made these southern sailors incredibly valuable to the Egyptian state. Control of the cataract route was the key to accessing the legendary wealth of Nubia and the lands beyond gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic animals. A pharaoh seeking to launch a military campaign into Nubia or send a trading expedition to the fabled land of Punt was entirely dependent on these local experts. The state went to great lengths to secure their loyalty, offering high-status positions, land grants, and other rewards to the most skilled cataract pilots and their families. These men were not mere laborers. They were strategic assets, as vital to the empire's expansion as its generals. Their ability to guide the royal fleet safely through the cataracts enabled Egypt to project its power hundreds of miles to the south, secure its borders, and fuel its economy with the unparalleled resources of Inner Africa, turning a natural barrier into a controlled gateway for imperial ambition. Yet, for all its sophistication and resilience, this vast body of knowledge did not survive intact. The intricate navigation secrets of the Nile sailors, on over 3,000 years, gradually faded into obscurity, becoming a ghost in the historical record. This was not a single, catastrophic loss, but a slow erosion, a confluence of factors that dissolved a living tradition into scattered clues for archaeologists to later decipher. The primary driver was quite simply the decline and eventual collapse of the civilization that had created it. As the power of the pharaohs waned and Egypt fell under the control of a succession of foreign rulers, first the Persians, then the Greeks under Alexander the Great, and finally the Romans, the highly centralized state that depended on this specialized knowledge began to crumble. The great royal projects that required moving colossal stones ceased. The organized state-run fleets that transported grain from royal estates were replaced by different economic models. The professional class of sailors, who once held a respected and vital role as civil servants, found their unique skills were no longer in such high demand. The knowledge, which had been passed from master to apprentice as a sacred trust, lost its economic and strategic value, and with no one to teach, the chain of oral transmission was broken. New technologies introduced by these foreign cultures also rendered the old ways obsolete. The magnetic compass, likely arriving from China via trade routes in the later centuries, provided a simple, reliable way to find direction that did not require a deep understanding of the stars or the ability to see the horizon on a cloudy night. While initially a curiosity for Mediterranean sailors, its adoption gradually made the complex celestial lore of the Nile captains seem like unnecessary ancient magic. Even more transformative for Nile navigation was the introduction of the lateen sail by Arab traders and conquerors centuries later. Unlike the Egyptian square sail, which was primarily effective with the following wind, the triangular lateen sail could be angled to catch the wind from the side, even from a direction forward of the beam. This allowed ships to sail much more efficiently against the wind, tacking back and forth in a zigzag pattern. This technological leap dramatically reduced the reliance on towing teams and the absolute necessity of the predictable northerly winds for upstream travel. The new sail made the river more manageable for newcomers, but in doing so, it bypassed the need for the deep, localized knowledge that was the Nile sailor's greatest asset. Why spend a lifetime learning to read the water's subtle whispers when a new piece of technology could achieve a similar result with far less effort? The river itself, the very subject of this mastery, also changed over the centuries. While the Nile's annual flood was the heartbeat of Egypt, its course was not entirely fixed. Over long periods, the river's meandering path would slowly shift, silting up old channels and carving out new ones. The relentless deposition of sediment, particularly in the delta region, gradually altered the coastline and the river's outlets to the sea. More dramatically, the construction of modern dams, starting with the Low Aswan Dam in the early 20th century and culminating in the High Aswan Dam in the 1960s, fundamentally tamed the river. These colossal structures ended the annual inundation, that defining seasonal cycle around which the entire Egyptian calendar and agricultural life had been built. For navigation, this meant the river's depth became constant and predictable, but it also raised the very challenges that had necessitated such advanced skills. The dangerous sandbanks that shifted with each flood were now fixed. The vast, disorienting lake of the inundation season became a thing of the past. The river was made safe for modern shipping, but in the process, the dynamic, living personality that the ancient sailors had learned to converse with was silenced, its language forgotten because it was no longer spoken. Ultimately, the greatest vulnerability of this knowledge system was its very nature. It was an oral tradition, a map written in memory and song rather than on papyrus. This was its strength for millennia, making it flexible and secure within a closed guild of experts. But it was also its Achilles heel. When that guild disbanded, when the last master captain died without an apprentice to whom he could sing the chants that mapped the river, the knowledge vanished as completely as a whisper on the wind. Unlike the texts of scribes, which could lie dormant in a tomb for centuries and be read again, the sailor's wisdom was ephemeral. What remains for us today are the indirect clues, the tomb paintings showing ships with their sails set, the reliefs of towing teams, the archaeological remains of buried boats like the magnificent solar bark of Khufu. We are left to piece together the puzzle, inferring their incredible skill from the evidence of their achievements, the obelisks they moved, the empires they supplied, the vast distances they traveled with such apparent ease. The loss of their secrets is a poignant reminder that not all progress is additive. Sometimes, a deeply nuanced understanding of the world can be traded for a simpler, more universally accessible technology, leaving us to wonder at the quiet genius of those who listened to the river and understood its every word. And so, our voyage down the timeless Nile draws to a close, not just at a geographical destination, but at a deeper understanding of human achievement. The true legacy of these master sailors is not merely that they traveled from point A to point B, but in how they accomplished it. Their genius did not lie in a single revolutionary invention like a compass or a detailed chart. Instead, it was a symphony of skills, a holistic wisdom born from generations of watching, listening, and learning. They achieved mastery by forging a profound partnership with the natural world, viewing the river not as an adversary to be conquered, but as a living entity to be understood and respected. They saw the stars not as distant lights, but as a celestial clock and compass. They interpreted the wind as a tangible force, and the water's surface as a transparent map of the world below. This was a technology of the mind, a seamless integration of astronomy, meteorology, and intuition that turned a challenging river into a predictable highway. This ancient expertise stands as a powerful reminder for our modern world, where we often rely on digital screens and satellite signals to tell us where we are. The Nile sailors possessed a self-reliant knowledge that was immune to power failure or signal loss. Their navigation system was built on the immutable laws of physics and the predictable cycles of nature. In an age where we can feel disconnected from the environment, their story reconnects us to the fundamental idea that the greatest technology is, and has always been, human ingenuity. It is the ability to observe, to adapt, and to find elegant solutions using the tools that the world itself provides. The sailors of the Nile teach us that true mastery comes not from dominating nature, but from learning its language and moving in harmony with its rhythms. Their silent work was the invisible engine that powered one of history's most enduring civilizations. Every block of the Great Pyramid, every sack of grain that fed a city, every royal decree that unified the kingdom, traveled on the current of their knowledge. They were the unsung heroes, the vital threads woven into the fabric of pharaonic power, proving that history is not only made by kings and conquerors, but also by the skilled hands and brilliant minds of those who make the impossible possible. They challenge us to look beyond the monuments and look instead to the river, to see the incredible feat of logistics and understanding that made those monuments possible in the first place. As we step back from the banks of the Nile, we're left to wonder what other incredible secrets have been lost to time, what other sophisticated knowledge systems, developed by ancient cultures around the world, have faded away, leaving only echoes in the archaeological record. The story of the Nile sailors is just one chapter in humanity's vast book of forgotten wisdom. What lost secret of the ancient world would you like to see us explore next? Perhaps the celestial navigation of the Polynesian voyagers who crossed the vast Pacific, or the acoustic wonders of ancient theaters, or the hydraulic engineering that supplied water to desert cities. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you've enjoyed this journey into the heart of an ancient mystery, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next adventure into the depths of history. Thank you for sailing with us.